Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Lover Girl. Before I get started, I do want to provide a disclaimer that this episode is going to be covering a lot of sensitive topics. Lately, it's been weighing heavily on my mind how the years have flown by so quickly. It seems like it was just yesterday that I was in my 20s. It doesn't seem like a lifetime ago, although it actually is. When I reflect on my life and where I currently stand, I recognize that I'm not in the same place as my peers. When I take a look at my family members who are in the same generation as I am, they're all married, they have their kids, they have their families, and then here I am, the single one who is a single parent and all alone. So from society's perspective, I don't live a normal life. But if I really dive deep, I've actually lived a lot of life with a great amount of life experience under my belt. I've been married, I've been divorced, I have children, I've been in long-term relationships, I've gone through difficult breakups, and I feel like with all of these life moments and challenges I've faced, I know that I can get through anything. So I've been finding myself typically dating younger men, and these men want to get married one day, they want to have kids, which is great. I think that's something they should definitely experience if that's what they want for themselves. However, I feel like I've surpassed that point in my life. If it were to happen for me, then that's just what it's going to be. But it's definitely not what I'm seeking at the moment. What I want for myself is to find someone I can have a lasting bond with. I don't want to lock anyone down. I don't want to hold anyone against their will. I want to find someone who actually wants to be with me, no matter the circumstances. I just want a real, genuine connection. So, growing up, I had a pretty difficult childhood. In the household I grew up in, I experienced physical abuse, domestic violence, and generational trauma. The summer I turned 17, there was an incident that happened where my father was removed from our home. And when this happened, a huge part of me felt liberated. It felt like I could finally breathe and finally move on from such a traumatic life. During this time, I was going through a transition where I had to move out of my childhood home into a new town and attend a new school for my senior year. At first, I was excited about this change. I was thrilled to experience something new until it actually happened. I realized that the transition wasn't going to be so easy. So right before the school year started, I was determined to make new friends so that I could have some type of comfort going into this new school. I had already known a few people who went to that school and had gone to that school from some of my family members and from mutual connections. So I had called up a guy I knew. I heard that he had a crush on me, so I assumed he was open to hang out. And I thought that if I could befriend him, that would open up doors to new friendships. So I ended up heading over to this guy's house, and he invited me into his room. We had just been hanging out talking. Then he asked me if I wanted to order pizza. He had his house phone in his hand, about to make this call, and I was excited for some pizza. I was hungry. The next thing I knew, I had just been hanging out on his bed, and then all of a sudden he positioned himself in between my legs, and he had his hand on my shorts, trying to unbutton it. I grabbed his hand and sternly asked him what he was doing. At this moment, I was laying on my back, and I was moving to get further away from him, trying to keep the opening of my shorts together. But I wasn't strong enough to fight him. And I knew that his little sisters were in the house, and they were listening in on what was going on inside of the room. So I tried to be as quiet as possible while telling him no over and over again, because I didn't want it to be traumatic for his little sisters. The next thing I knew, my shorts were coming off, and he had gripped onto me so tightly that I couldn't move away. The entire time, I repeated the word no while I shook my head as my eyes filled up with tears. The entire incident happened so quickly, and he ended up finishing on my stomach. He had given me something to clean it off with, and I remained quiet the entire time after. I tried really hard to keep it together, trying to gaslight myself into thinking that he was just some guy that I had slept with. But deep down, I felt a sense of despair because if I had the option, I wouldn't have had sex with him. For the most part, I tried to keep it to myself, thinking that if people were to ever find out, they would believe him over me because he had all of these friends and I felt insecure about my credibility. When the new school year started, I had not adjusted well, and I ended up dropping out shortly after. I convinced my mother that I would work on getting my GED while I worked full-time. I ended up getting a job at the local mall and this cute little souvenir shop. One morning I had opened the store, and my view was a sports store which hadn't opened up yet. I saw this guy standing outside of the closed gates. He had his hair grown out, which reminded me of an old classmate. I would see him often, and every time I saw him, he just reminded me of this guy that I went to school with. I began to notice that he would look towards my direction quite often. Then we found ourselves staring at each other throughout the day, and it was just some game we would play, which would get me excited to go to work. However, we never really spoke to each other or saw one another up close in person until I went into his store pretending to look for something. And when I did, I was surprised that he wasn't willing to flirt with me or have a longer conversation with me, so I sort of left it at that. But a couple of weeks later, he walked into my store and ended up buying something from me. I thought it was pretty cute because my place of work wasn't a typical spot I assumed he'd shop in. And then one night, I had been scheduled to work at a different location, and I had my mom pick me up after my shift. My mother had arrived early, waiting for me in her vehicle, and as I made my way to her car, there he was, the guy who worked across from me, sitting on a bench. Although I had seen my mom waiting for me, there was my crush, sitting there all alone, and I felt like I needed to do something. So I walked up to him and said, "Hey, I know you," and mentioned that I worked across from him. We began talking, and I learned that he lived in the same area as I did. In this moment, I was feeling bold in this conversation, so I said to him, "Why don't you take me home?" He mentioned that he was actually waiting for his cousin to get off of work, and he was there to bring her home. So we had ended up exchanging numbers, and I had left with my mom. This is when I learned that his name was Noah. Noah called me the next day, and he asked me out on a date. I was so excited to go on a date with him. He was very sweet to me. He picked me up on our date, and we spent all night together. After that first night, it just felt so magical. The both of us were so smitten over one another, and it felt like I found the love of my life, that I found the one for me. We became exclusive shortly after, and at 17, I was just so in love with this man that I wanted to give him all of the love that I had to offer. So much so that I was willing to turn a blind eye on some of the not so great things he was doing. So I had learned that he had been stealing from his job. And when he confessed this to me, I questioned if it was my fault, if I had been a bad influence to him. But he reassured me that it had nothing to do with me. So he was completely opposite from me as far as his morals, his thought process, his way of life. He smoked weed and cigarettes every day. He drank alcohol. He went to parties. Those weren't things I did. It was just not me. But I loved him. A few months into us dating, he disclosed to me that his aunt was kicking him out of her house and he needed to move back to his hometown. That's when I foolishly suggested that I move with him. Now, I would have done anything for him. And looking back, I had behaved so irresponsibly because at that time, I had just purchased my first vehicle under my mom's name with my money. And I was willing to walk away from that just to be with him. But once I turned 18, I packed my bags, left everything behind, and moved with him back to his hometown. Now, I thought this was going to be a great opportunity, but once he settled in, the dynamic between us was completely different. He was willing to ditch me to hang out with his friends, and all they ever did was smoke pot and gamble. I was in this new place, and I had nothing and no one. I didn't even have a job. I felt so insecure and so out of place. Frankly, I just felt worthless. It took an emotional toll on me. It wasn't something I was prepared for. So after a few months, I ended up heading back home. Before I left, I had left behind a notebook under our bed. In it, I had written down all of my feelings, expressing how sad and hurt I was to be there. Once I got home, Noah called me crying, saying that he had found this notebook, telling me how sorry he was that I had felt that way. He begged me to come back, telling me that if I did, things would get better. And foolishly, I believed him. So 3 weeks later, I headed back to be with him. And when I did, I instantly regretted it. I was so unhappy and so displeased with this relationship. We fought all the time about the most ridiculous things, and I felt like he wasn't prioritizing me the way that I thought he should have been. I felt resentful about the fact that I had uprooted my entire life to be with him, and he wasn't showing up the same way for me. I just felt sad and lonely. We had been fighting constantly, and it felt like I had been submersed in an ocean of heavy feelings. The instability that I was feeling at the time made me feel unsafe, and it really took a toll on my mental health. I felt mad at myself for choosing him, but at the same time, I loved him so much. However, the toxicity got the best of us, and I felt in desperate need to leave once again. I asked my brother to purchase a ticket for me to fly back home, and when I did, I pulled the same tactic with a notebook to see if I could get his attention once again. This time, it didn't work. I didn't get a crying phone call from Noah. However, what I did get was a positive pregnancy test. And when this happened, I was really excited. I felt like this would seal the deal, where I was able to keep Noah in my life. And I thought this was a perfect opportunity for us to be a family and for him to change and finally grow up. When Noah found out about my pregnancy, he decided to move in with me. However, his friends weren't excited for him at all, and I could hear it in the tone of their voice. They were never happy for us. They didn't think we were good together, and in retrospect, we weren't. So when he moved back to be with me, he immediately got a construction job, and I was really excited for him. I had been working also. However, I stopped mid-pregnancy because I was feeling sick all the time. So I had grown up with religion in my household, where I would study the Bible once a week since I was 7 years old. Being that I was pregnant, I felt obligated to get married. And when I brought this up to Noah, he seemed completely fine with it. He didn't seem hesitant at all. He actually told me that he was glad it was with me. When he said these things, I felt reassured about my decision, and we ended up having a small ceremony a month after I turned 19, which was 2 months before I was due to give birth. However, a week into our marriage, I was still at a place where I was disappointed with his actions, and I irritatedly said to him that I wanted a divorce, but he immediately shut that down. It seemed like he wanted this novelty of romance in his life, but he wasn't willing to put in the work. Little did I know that we were so completely different in our mindsets, that we were absolutely wrong for each other. But I was just so in love with him. Right before I had given birth, Noah had turned 21 years old. And when this happened, he was going out with his coworkers every single weekend. At this time, I was still underage. I was 2 years younger than him, and there was nothing I could do. I was just sitting at home pregnant, waiting for him. After I gave birth, I was hoping that things would be different between us. I thought that we would have more of a family dynamic and he would be more present as a father. However, that wasn't the case. He was more focused on being 21, drinking, hanging out with his friends, acting his age. At that age, that is what you should be doing. However, for the both of us, we were both young parents who had this immense responsibility in our hands. At least that was the case for me. At this time, I didn't realize it, but I was suffering from postpartum depression. I was just so young and so ignorant that I didn't understand what was going on with my body and my mind. I was at another low point in my life, and Noah just deemed me to be crazy. Meanwhile, he was going out every weekend, while I was bearing all of the responsibility of being a parent. And although we were married, I was getting sick of his bullshit. I would, quote unquote, break up with him and tell him to leave. On the weekdays, he would come crawling back, apologizing and telling me he wanted to be with me. But on the weekends, it was a different story, and he was back to his normal ways. This went on for quite some time, yet I always found it in my heart to forgive him. But I did hold a resentment towards him. It was as if I loved him and cared about him, but deep down, I hated him so much. The toxicity between us escalated, and our fights would get very heated. At this time, we were living with my family, and they were well aware of our relationship dynamic. Looking back, it was very embarrassing for me. But at this time, I was still a teenager who was a wife and a young mother. And frankly, I don't think I had the right head on my shoulders. While being a young mother and having an unstable marriage, I was feeling very bad about myself. With my husband going out all the time, there would be instances where I would find other women's numbers in his phone. So the fact that I had a husband, yet I was still competing with other women, made me feel absolutely awful. With time, it became evident that Noah had a drinking problem. There would be times where he would drink so much and black out and not realize what he was doing. I received a call from him one early morning where he told me he was drunk and he needed me to pick him up. I knew exactly where he was, but the security wouldn't let me go through because I wasn't allowed in that area. And at this point, he wasn't picking up his phone, he wasn't answering my calls, so all I could do was go back home and worry about him. The next day, he came home and acted like nothing happened. Being married to him felt stressful and agonizing. I began to form ulcers in my stomach, and every time I ate or stressed out, the pain in my stomach was unbearable. I expressed this to Noah, but my feelings and my words were never acknowledged. One night, I was looking through his phone and I saw that he had been texting another woman. So I decided to text her from my phone, and we ended up having some really aggressive text exchanges. I confronted Noah about this, and I questioned him several times because I just wanted him to tell me the truth. He ended up confessing to me that he had gotten so drunk that he had slept with this woman. And then he had the audacity to say to me that he didn't cheat on me because he didn't come. I cried an immense amount, and I had fought with him so much about this. But he continued to tell me that he didn't even like her, and he didn't find her attractive, that it was just a big mistake. And for a moment I believed him, until I learned that he continued to see her. There was a lot of text fighting between this woman and myself. And there was a lot of fighting between Noah and myself also. However, no matter how bad it got, Noah would always come back to me. So he basically left this woman behind. But it got to a point where she became obsessed and she began stalking me. So I needed to get law enforcement involved for her to leave me alone. It was very difficult for me to get past this infidelity. However, I don't know how to explain this, but when I got cheated on, my sex drive escalated. And I don't know if it was because I had to prove that I was better than the other woman, or if it was because I was turned on about the fact that someone else was attracted to my husband. But I just wanted him so much more. And it felt like we were getting to a better place because of this. At least that's what I wanted for us. But after some time, he was reverting back to his old ways, going out all the time while leaving me and our child behind. And I didn't like this. So in high school, I had a huge crush on this guy named Tyler, but nothing ever happened between us. We were always just friends. But during the time that I was unhappy in my marriage, I was communicating with Tyler through social media. Since Noah wasn't always around, Tyler would invite me over to his house to hang out, which I did because I felt lonely. Evenings when Noah wasn't around and I had no idea where he was, I would be at Tyler's house. And we began spending a lot of time together, to the point where things became flirtatious with us. One thing led to another, and we ended up having sex. When this started, I was feeling guilty because I was married, but I was also still feeling spiteful from the time that he had cheated on me, from him neglecting me and not prioritizing me. So here was Tyler giving me all of the attention that I was craving, and I took it. I knew it wasn't going to lead to anything, but it did boost my self-esteem. So one night, Noah and I went for a drive, and it was just the two of us spending time together. He was aimlessly driving throughout the town. I didn't know where he was going. I was just happy to be spending time with him. But then he started driving through Tyler's block a couple of times. And when he did, I imagined my vehicle being parked right in front of his house. And that is when I knew that Noah had caught on to me. However, I didn't say anything, and neither did he. So at some point, it wasn't difficult for me to let Tyler go and stay with Noah because Noah was a person I truly loved, no matter what he put me through. And I knew that Tyler didn't really like me like that. He just saw me as a challenge. So a few months go by and we end up moving into this new place, which my mother had purchased. She asked me if I could help her with the mortgage, and I agreed. I asked Noah, and he agreed as well. So I thought we could make this work. A few months into living there, I woke up one morning and I was perfectly happy. We had a great night before that, and I felt fine. I turned to Noah, asking him if he had paid a bill with the money that I had given him. He told me that he hadn't paid for it, so I asked him where the money was. He told me that he didn't have it and that he had spent it. The fact that I couldn't count on him for anything drove me insane. And all I could ask was how he could not care, how he could be so irresponsible. I was infuriated. So I went to his backpack and I found a stash of weed. I headed straight into the bathroom and locked myself in there while Noah chased after me. I threw the weed in the toilet and Noah broke the door open. That's when he shoved me out of the bathroom and shut the door. I began crying, saying, "This is all you care about." It was so painful for me, and at that moment, my sadness turned into anger. At this point, I saw red, and I demanded that he get out. I began taking all of his things from the closet and throwing it down the stairs. I repeated myself, telling him he needed to leave, and it just got so ugly to the point where he was holding me down, telling me not to touch his things. But I had already reached my boiling point that I wanted everything that was his out of the house. I was just so angry that I was picking anything and everything off of the floor and throwing it down the stairs. Then I saw a pair of small scissors. I picked it up and threw it down the stairs without looking. The next thing I heard was Noah say, "That hit me, you know." But I simply ignored him and shut the door behind me. I needed to head into work that morning, so I pulled myself together, tried to calm down as best as I could, and I got my day started. At this time, I was working in a cute little shop, and 2 hours into my shift, 2 police officers come walking in. One of them was really handsome, so I had a big smile on my face. He looked at me, and then he looked at my coworker, who looked incredibly frightened. So he asked her if she was me. She had no words at this point, so she just looked in my direction and pointed at me. I identified myself, and the police officer asked if he could speak to me outside. So I followed him out, and he said to me, "I'm going to have to arrest you right now." I remained calm and said to him, "All right, can we not do this in public?" He said that was fine and told me to gather my belongings. They put me in the back of the cop car, and I asked the officers if I was in big trouble. One of them responded with, "You just got arrested." And I was 20 years old. I didn't know what this meant, and I had never gotten in trouble with law enforcement this bad before. They bring me to the police station, and I get my mugshot taken, my fingerprints, they're checking my purse, and then they have me sit down on this chair while this handsome police officer is sitting across from me in front of a computer. I was sitting there patiently wondering what was going to happen next. Then the officer said to me, "You're pretty quiet." I sat there a bit taken back because I didn't know how to respond to that. So then he asked me what I like to do for fun. And that's when I realized he wanted to have a conversation with me, as in he wanted to get to know me a little better. And I had sat there for quite a few hours having a conversation with this man. Then he said to me, "If someone doesn't come and bail you out, I'm going to have to put you in a jail cell." So I called up my cousin because I knew that she had the funds to bail me out. On my drive home, I had called up a girlfriend to tell her about the crazy day I had just had. That's when she suggested that I head over to her place because her and her boyfriend were heading to the club that night. At this time, I wasn't able to drink legally, and neither was she, but her boyfriend was. She had this grandeur plan where we would use her fake ID, then switch off on wristbands. So after the day that I had just had, I knew I needed this. When we got there, our plan worked perfectly. Once we got inside, it was packed with a room full of people. It was dark and the music was so loud. While I walked through the sea of people, I spotted Noah. He was by himself, which I was surprised about. I knew he had seen me. I walked right past him without giving him a glance. I didn't care about him at this point, but I knew he was keeping an eye on me. Every time I looked his way, he would pretend as if he hadn't been just staring at me. At one point, some random man asked me to dance with him, so I did. And the 4 of us were having so much fun. I felt really happy. I was just enjoying my time. Then at the end of the song, this man grabbed my face with his hands and kissed me. It came out of nowhere, but I knew that Noah saw, and I was ecstatic about it. At the end of the night, my friends took me home, and I had just been so satisfied with the evening that I wasn't thinking about the blowout fight that I had with Noah that morning. I wasn't thinking about how I had gotten arrested. I just felt happy, and I had the biggest smile on my face. I opened the front door and began walking up the stairs. Then I saw a dark figure exit my bedroom door. It was Noah, and he was waiting for me at the top of the staircase. I gave him the cold shoulder while he interrogated me about the evening. I snapped at him and told him that he had gotten me arrested. He tried to defend himself, saying it was his aunt who made him call the cops, and that he would have never done that to me. It had been such a long day that I just wanted to go to bed, and I allowed him to stay that evening. We continued to stay together even after that incident, but although I continued to stay with him, I was holding in this anger and resentment towards him. So this relationship was very toxic. At times I would think we were fine, and we did have a really healthy sex life, but that must have been the best thing about our relationship. So we had been married for about a year and a half, and I found out that I was pregnant again. So when I told him this, I was really excited about it. I thought we were growing our family, and whatever issues we were having, I thought we could work it out. Because marriages and relationships aren't supposed to be easy, but getting through the difficult times is really what makes a bond stronger. So even after finding out that we were pregnant, his behavior still wasn't up to par, and I felt like he still had a lot of growing up to do. But it wasn't long before I started feeling that I was getting fed up with him again. Noah continued in his childish patterns, which frustrated me, to the point where I would once again ask him to leave. However, one night, he had planned a romantic evening for us, where he had made dinner for the both of us, made a bubble bath, and wrote me a heartfelt letter. Now all of this was very unusual for him to do, and I couldn't recall him doing anything like this for me before. In my mind, I thought that he was ready to change his ways. In the letter, he apologized for his behavior. He mentioned he wanted to change and do better. and said that he was excited to grow our family. He really put on a show for me, and to be honest with you, I was excited. I thought I was finally getting a husband who I could actually count on. After that night, we were good for a couple of weeks until he started going out again, and I would just be waiting around for him. One night, he came home, set his things down, and went right to bed. Once he was fast asleep, I decided to go through his backpack. While looking through his bag, I found a flip phone which I didn't recognize. I took a moment to examine it, then all of a sudden it started ringing. So I answered the call without saying a word. Then a woman started singing on the other end. I listened to her for a moment, then I said to her, "Who is this?" And that's when she immediately hung up. My heart started racing, so I went over to the bed to wake Noah up. I could hear the trembling in my voice as I said his name over and over again, trying to wake him up. When he finally did, the first thing I asked him was whose phone that was that I was holding in my hand, which I had found in his backpack. He told me it wasn't his. He told me it was his cousin's, who he hung out with frequently. So Noah had done this before where he would blame things on his cousin. There was even a time when I went on a trip with my family, and when I came home, I found a condom in my back seat. I confronted Noah about it, and he told me that it was his cousin's and that he had been using my vehicle. I believed him then, but at this moment, I didn't want to. I told him to get out of bed, and I demanded that he tell me the truth. He just stood there and continued to lie to me. But I had this gut feeling that something was wrong. Inside, I felt shattered, and I fell to my knees. I began begging him, pleading to tell me the truth. But he just stood there and hummed as if the way that I was behaving was a joke. As if what he had seen me doing was the most ridiculous thing he'd ever seen. And when I was down on the floor, I couldn't believe that my life had come down to this. I couldn't believe I was in this position. It was the absolute lowest point in my life. So Noah continued to stand his ground and tell me that it wasn't his. I asked him if we were fine, and he reassured me we were. I went to bed exhausted that night, but I was still feeling uneasy about the situation. The next day we were in bed together, and I had been clinging on to him as if I was holding on for dear life. I told him to tell me he loved me, but he wouldn't say it. I continued to tell him to do so because I just needed to hear it from him. And that's when he turned to me and said, "I don't want to be with you." And when he said this, my heart completely shattered. I couldn't believe I had just heard those words from my husband. So I became infuriated, and I began screaming at him, telling him to leave. At that moment, I wanted to get him out of my life, out of my house, out of my face as soon as possible. Once he left, I continued to scream and I couldn't stop crying. I had somehow fallen asleep that night, but the next morning I woke up to these painful cramps. And when I went to the bathroom, I saw that I had been bleeding. So I called Noah's mom and told her what was happening. She immediately took me to the ER. I had been waiting on a hospital bed for hours, and I had been crying on and off the entire time. Then a nurse came in and she began asking me questions. One of the questions she asked me was if I was married. My voice trembled when I said yes, but it hurt knowing that I wasn't going to be much longer. Once the doctor came in, it was a pivotal moment where he asked me if I wanted to save this baby or not. That came as a surprise to me because I had been bleeding so much that I didn't think it was a possibility. However, when he asked me this question, I didn't know how to answer him. I ended up leaving the hospital while I continued to bleed and was told to stay on bed rest. The next day, the cramping got worse, so I went to the bathroom and I ended up miscarrying in my toilet. The most painful part about the situation is that I experienced most of it by myself. I was dealing with something so traumatizing, and I had to face it all on my own. At this point in my life, I felt like a part of me had died, and I had completely changed as a person. That summer I had turned 21, and I was drowning my sorrows in alcohol. I began dating people, hurting feelings, and breaking hearts, but I didn't even care. I just knew that I never wanted to be that weak, or that vulnerable, or experience such a low point in my life ever again. And I believe that's the reason why I've chosen to date toxic, emotionally unavailable men, and the reason why I won't allow anyone in, although doing so has allowed me to dodge some major bullets. Yet at the same time, I know I have been closed off to a lot of great people as well. But going through this experience, especially at a young age, has undoubtedly messed me up. But I do still feel hopeful that one day I will meet someone who will be able to understand me, where I will be able to open up to them and love them as much as I loved Noah, but in a much more safe and mature environment. Because when I do find the right person for me, with much of my experience, I know I'll be able to love them the right way.